And we are live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. Vast Vision Campfire Stories Day 1. I'm no longer Curtis Weeb. He is taken off for the rest of the afternoon. It is now me, Joe, and I'm here with Brandon Graham, who you guys know from a number of books, Prophet, King City, Rain Like Hammers, and then one, his newest one that is coming out for the folks at Live in the Line, Moonray, that we're a little bit tied together on. Brandon, what's up, man? Welcome.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, dude. Um, so thinking we talk a lot because, like I said, we're working together on Moonray with edits and that kind of thing, and day to day working on a project. So I thought we're doing the Storytellers Convention. It'd be kind of cool to back up a little bit and just like talk like why are we doing this? Like not specifically Moonray, although we'll get there. But
Like a
like
crying in the shower moment, like why are we doing this?
no, man, not crying at all. Like I just, we're two guys who love comics, and I think that's a cool thing. And I kind of like
Sure.
to talk to you about why that is and why we're making it. So, again, we've known each other a long time. Even before you were doing Profit and I was doing Glory. So kind of have a little bit of an idea of this. I know you had a big brother who was into like underground comic stuff, but I am curious, like what your initial like contact, like first contact with comics. Like, do you remember what that was?
Yeah, I've actually been going back. I think I've been thinking a lot about how I recently have been spending this year in LA and reconnecting with some old friends and everything. And I've noticed a pattern of people that have spent their lives in comics hit this point where we kind of start doing autopsies on our lives and going back and
Yeah.
what is going on here? And a big part of that for me was when a couple years ago when I did a reread through of all the Tintin books.
Hmm.
And my because I had parents that read comics. Like my mom had a letter published in Spider-Man when she was in college, and my dad was big into underground comics, like Furry Freak Brothers and Captain Piscums and all that stuff that you want kids to read.
Right
And
on. Yeah.
but the earliest stuff, I think it was Tintin, Asterix, and Richie Rich comics. Oh, and some Disney comics too. And that stuff, I think it's all really high quality because I go back to that stuff and like I think somewhere in my stack of books here, yeah, I've got a Richie Rich here. And I'll just like I was reading this thing yesterday and I was like, still holds up. This is solid stuff. And I did a diary comic recently as another project I'm working on. It's a collection of my diary stuff. And I was talking about like just how weird it was that like, I was a kid growing up in low income housing and I was being given Scrooge McDuck and Richie Rich comics.
Right.
And there was no resentment there. It was just weird to me that like the cover of this is that Richie Rich is uh put jewels and gold on his tires so he can deal with the snow. It's just this insane abstract concept. But yeah, going back to that stuff, it was just weird fun comics, I think, that were well done.
So it's a collection of what your mom had and what your dad had, and then that's sort of what trickled down, or because
I mean,
even
I
like back
think
then, getting Asterix and Tintin out here was kind of unusual.
maybe. I mean, I know I feel like in the 80s there might have been a good push for Tintin and Asterix because I
Well,
remember
Little
seeing
Brown was pushing Tintin hard, yeah, and then I mean, like I have these cousins who'd never read comics except they were reading Asterix and Tintin,
yeah,
and like that was it. But I will say they were always going to Europe like for the summers or whatever. So I think they like would go to Asterix World and the Tintin Land or whatever
sure.
amusement parks they have out there. So were you getting that from like the library or where was that
Yeah,
coming from?
I think the library and bookstores and things like that. Yeah, those ones were around. And also I remember like comic stores kind of came into existence when I was pretty young, uh, in the Pacific Northwest, and my older brother was going to them a lot and bringing back things, and
Do you
that
know
made it
what
easy.
do you know what the shops were? Like because this is in West Seattle, is that right?
Yeah, this might have been pre West Seattle when I was living in
Oh
Oregon.
wow.
There's a place called Rocket Comics really early on. I
Okay.
remember.
Right
Uh,
on.
it's a little bit later, but I think the first comic I bought with my own money was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Raphael special that Eastman Laird did with the
Oh
red and
yeah. Yeah. The orange and black cover that's like kind of like
yeah,
a weird oversized shape.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember my copy like essentially like disintegrated over time because it was just like it was so different than the rest of the comics that I had,
Yeah.
you know, and format wise, because everything else I had was, pretty standardized, 1980s, the format still kind of existing to this day. But
Yeah.
that was like trying to figure out some sort of like secret document that I found because it was
That
it
reminds
was
me,
again weirdly colored and sized. What?
just saw or that James Stocco just did a recent Ninja Turtles cover, I think for the IDW line, and they
Oh, right on.
did it in those original colors. You know, James is a guy that me and you have known for a long time, and my
Yeah.
initial thought was like, this looks beautiful, but there's no way he was alive when those books came out.
Yeah, I remember. I've been thinking, like, talking about doing autopsies to your time with comics. I remember seeing that, and appropriately enough, a comic could be talking to the gentleman in about an hour, Madman #1 at a comic store called Superior Comics,
Oh, nice, Mike
and
Howard.
they both just stood out so much, and it was like finding artifacts from like his alternate reality civilization, just because they were so different from everything else. Um, all right, so you're reading Richie Rich, you're reading Tintin. What's the transition from going from like I'm a guy who loves reading these things to I'm assuming you're drawing these things, right? Are you drawing on loose paper or what? Where does that come from?
Yeah, yeah. I had my mom is a writer, so we always had stacks of typing paper around. So that was mostly what I
Uh-huh.
was drawing. It was these big stacks of 8.5 by 11 typing paper, and I would just staple them together and draw comics with crayons. I had a thing called Super Team when I was a kid that I did for
That
a
was the
year.
name of the book, Super Team.
Yeah, yeah. It was a Daring Dog and Fearless Frog were the main characters.
Okay, I don't want to get in a sidebar, but I will say that book needs to happen in 2024. Brandon Graham, Super Team. Pretty great.
I don't know if I got it in me anymore, but maybe. I mean, that would be. I mean, I like how insanely indulgent that would be to try to go back and be like, all right, 40 years later, let's let's
Hey
finally bring.
man, it's working great for Larson. I'll say that, drawing that book after,
Sure, sure.
since
Oh,
he
that
was a
reminds me.
child.
Another thing I'm really clicking with lately is I've been reading the biography of another Eric Larson, who
Different
was one
guy.
of Disney's
Yeah,
Heinl, and
right.
one of the things that really stuck out to me that I was thinking about when we were going to talk about kind of the why comics and why
Mhm.
it's just that there's a scene in it where they are uh, in early Disney, they were literally just taking rocks and dropping them in buckets of water to try to figure out a different way to do splashes that weren't like kind of cliche splashes. And it made me
Yeah,
think that there's both a value in figuring out kind of reinventing the wheel and being like, this is not a cliche cartoon splash, which makes more sense for animation,
right.
I think. But with comic books, I feel like you're kind of developing a visual language. So there's almost an advantage in being like, here's a cartoon version of a splash that's easily identifiable, almost like it's like the letter A you're doing over or a word. And that was something that when thinking about kind of the appeal of comics is really fascinating to me is telling stories with pictures and words, and you can basically like your own version because there's a larger scale of like if somebody like punches someone and it says pow, then that's pretty universal. But
Yeah,
accents, the style things that different artists put on it, and you can have a new Tintin always does this little swirl thing when he's running, and it's a
right.
very Franco-Belgian way to show movement. And I like that it's like sometimes I'll put something like that in my stuff, and it's just almost a little twist, putting a little a little like here's a mix of European stuff in my stuff.
Yeah, right on, man. Um, yeah, I think there is something cool that, like, I think back to somebody like Dave Sim, right? And you read the first 25 issues of Cerebus, and it's like, obviously, you're really into Barry Windsor Smith Conan,
Sure.
but it's like in going back to these influences, he develops this visual language with him and later on Gerhard of just like that becomes something entirely of its own. When you were talking about the splashes, the Disney guys were, I was thinking later, very like towards the end of Cerebus, towards I think it was like maybe even in the last few issues, where he was doing this thing where how the water would come on the window and it would like this like mix of sound effects and the way the water was looking is something that was uniquely him because he was hand lettering it and it was just something that you couldn't replicate in everything else, but it also looked so natural. It was an interesting mix. And to see him go from, the Barry Windsor Smith Conan riffs to that over the course of the 300 issue, and it's a little tiny, 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 tiny thing that's easy to miss. But yeah, there's
Yeah,
something really cool about how you develop that language.
yeah, and it's really interesting to see kind of because Cerebus is such a huge long form comic
Yeah.
that um, I'll always talk to people and they're like, "Where do I start?" And I always recommend that if they're going to read the first volume of it, that they better be Conan fans already because it's
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
steeped in the language of Conan. And it's interesting, like thinking kind of almost like the children of different styles, because also ElfQuest is really like a owes a lot of influence to the Barry Windsor Smith Conan as well.
Oh yeah.
And then you have like Sim basically develops his own language of Cerebus over doing 300 issues. And then you have people like Martin Wagner's Hepcats and Drew Hayes'
Hmm.
Boys and Elves that don't have any Barry Windsor Smith in them, but they are totally children of Cerebus. And that's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I mean, even Turtles to a certain extent. I mean, that was only a few years later, you know. And then that it adds cool because then it's like, you have this guy who's obsessed with Barry Wintersmith, right? So he does Cerebus and he does this like funny thing. And then, I don't know if because I don't think he had like, I'm gonna do 300 issues until about Church and State, maybe, which was about like 25, maybe High Society around there.
Yeah, it
But
is kind of it's kind of impressive because I feel like we all have that kind of younger hubris where we're like, I remember when you were starting Glory, you had like 100 issue plan,
yeah.
and then you like get 10 issues in, and you're like, all right, let's
No, it
do
was even other than that. It was the third issue. I was like,
it. Okay,
no, what this really is that I have ideas for like 6 books that I want to do, but this is
yeah,
like my first time getting hired and being paid money to make comic books. So I'm going
sure,
to try to run with this as much as possible and cram all these dumb ideas I had. Well, not dumb, actually, some of them are pretty cool, but all these ideas into this one book because who knows how long it's going to last. But yeah, it was Glory. It was number 3 when they're on Mars, and I was like, nah, this is 12 issues max. And I have to say that was a good revelation to have because I do think when you start off, especially, and you do start getting some momentum, you're just like, I want to keep this thing going as much as possible. And I think what I've learned is that each thing each series or whatever you get as a gift, and just let that have its natural lifespan. I mean,
yeah,
I don't, I don't never. Besides that little moment I had initially with Glory, which was misguided. I don't know. I've never had that instinct again to like this needs to go on forever as much as humanly possible.
I wonder how
Like
much.
Shutter number one, I knew was 30 issues. I
Sure.
was maybe 25, 30, ended up being 30 issues. That's as close as I can get.
Yeah, well, I wonder how many times Sim was just like in the middle of working on issue 57 and being like, what are you doing, dude?
Yeah, what have I gotten myself into?
Yeah, well, it's
I don't
interesting
know
now
though,
we
because
have. I was gonna say we have several books that have hit 300 now because you have
yeah.
Savage Dragon and Gold
Well,
Digger.
Savage
This is
Dragon's
what
not quite there. Savage Dragon's almost there. Spawn is at
oh,
300.
Spawn is there. Yeah, I
Spawn's
feel like I
there,
count
and Gold
Spawn
Digger.
less because it's less. I guess McFarlane wrote it all, but it's like having drawing on every page. I've been catching up on some missed Gold Digger recently,
Nice.
which I'm kind of confused by. Like I'm reading this and it really gives me as Fred Perry's Gold Digger. It's really reminding me of the fun of reading like Chris Claremont 80s X-Men.
How so? I'm not super familiar with Gold Digger
Oh,
beyond
it's
your
very
fandom of
simple.
it.
It's basically like
Here's
it's
what I know
about
about Gold Digger, just so you know. I know that you love it immensely. That's
sure.
just about it.
Yeah, no, it's really fun. So it's basically like there's a like a young female archaeologist explorer, and her father is a magician who adopted a were-cheetah, and the two of this explorer who's a scientist and a were-cheetah go on a bunch of adventures. It doesn't need to be more. There's not much more than that you need to know. And then he expanded it, past 300 because he stopped the series several times.
Mhm.
Like he did like a black and white series, and then was like, oh, we're starting again. So it almost feels like he's like, in Dragon Ball when they put weights on their on their
Oh, sure.
wrists and ankles to train, or his shoes were like made of lead. It feels like he's
Yeah.
doing the reaching 300 issues version of that.
Right on, man.
This one doesn't count. Let's do 300 in color.
Right on. Um, so before we get too much into stuff we're loving now, where like we glossed over it a little bit, but like so you were drawing on loose pieces of paper your mom had around. But
Sure.
when were you like I could do this as a living, or was it just like a primal thing that was within you and you just kept doing it until it got published?
I mean, I think I've told the story a lot about how when I was 7, my mom tells me that I kind of announced to her that I was going to do comics, excuse me, for a
Uh-huh.
living. And then it was kind of figuring that out over the course of my life. And it's funny because only after I started making comics actually for a living, which, I got published when I was 19. Antarctic Press put out a comic I did called October Yen. And then I started living off of comics by the time I did King City when I was about 30. And
Mm.
only after King City, like in my 30s and in my 40s, was I was like, is this, did I think of other options when I was 7? This is a weird career path. I mean, something cool about comics is it requires a lot of skill sets that within the medium. Like you can do graphic design, you can do storyboards and illustration and lettering and writing and all these different things. And so, like every time I dabble in other mediums, it's always like, this is not the combination of skill sets that I enjoy as much as comics. So I keep coming back to comics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Because you have done, I mean, you said you worked on Adventure Time, right? And that was storyboarding. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about, which is like it's part of the skill sets, but then you're ultimately want to get back to comics, or like what was doing it, taking your storytelling skills into another medium that's
Yeah,
tangentially
exactly.
related, like
Yeah. Or illustration jobs.
yeah,
Yeah. I did a science fiction pilot no one's seen ever that was like dabbling in live action film and stuff. But um, yeah, I mean, just kind of all over there. I mean, I think prose is probably the thing that appeals to me the most aside from comics, but then you don't get to draw pictures,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
Has that always been the case? Because I know your mom was a prose sci-fi writer. So has that been the case going back to then, or is that more of a recent development? Or
I mean, a lot of it is what I ingest, like I like,
yeah,
I'm old enough now that I read poetry every
hmm
day, you know?
yeah. You hit 40, and it's time to start reading more poetry. No, I get it.
Yeah, yeah. I went to a bookstore with my friend Tom Herpick yesterday, who did a bunch of Adventure Time stuff and is a fantastic cartoonist. And I talked him into buying, first of all, the cowboy book Rio, and then
Nice.
yeah, Doug
Yeah, right,
Wildman,
right on. Very cool.
yeah, creator of Johnny Quest.
Yeah, right on.
So he got that, and then he was also buying a poetry book. And I was telling him one of my processes for keeping my sanity these days is waking up in the morning and reading poetry before I deal with any uh, emails or looking at my phone or anything, just to kind of slow things down a little bit.
So okay, so you wake up, and who are you reading right now?
It goes back and forth. I mean, I have Alice Oswald is a big one of mine. She did this book called Memorial that's really fascinating. That's she took all the deaths from the Trojan War and are during poems about all of the people who died, and it's just the use of language is good. I have a very water damaged Bukowski book next to my
Right
desk
on.
right now, and his stuff's really fun. I don't me and me and my partner Casey do it read poetry a lot together, and Bukowski can get a little dark sometimes, so I don't start the
Yeah.
morning with that usually.
Yeah,
Like
that memorial book I remember you talking about when you were doing Prophet.
that was a big influence on Prophet. I would read pages of that kind of when I was starting the final draft to kind of remind me how like her use of language is so beautiful that I would Alice Oswald I would read a couple of the pages of her poetry and then being like, okay, those are some those are some great I've got that in my head and I can kind of try to carry that over into my own writing.
Right on. And so how do you feel that like so why poetry? Like how do you feel like that translates to comics? Is that just again a primal thing, or was there more of like a methodical way to go about it, or
I've
what?
been thinking of like so when I do diary comics, they're much more like single page, like this is what I'm doing today, and they're not stories in the sense of a comic or a movie or traditionally, and so I'm always thinking them as the comic book. There's no way to not sound douchey about it. It's like comic poetry, you know,
Right.
just
Yeah,
visual jazz, baby, you know.
yeah.
um, but yeah, it's like there's so many things that can like because I think in comics so much because I've done it for so long because that's my preferred medium. it's really fun to just try to be like, what's the visual way to talk about how I'm feeling today? And I use it a lot to manage emotions too. Like if I'm having a rough day and I just kind of draw it out in comic book panels, and figure out a way to kind of communicate it to myself, then it really helps kind of disperse negative feelings and process things, which has been really helpful.
Yeah, and I know you've been doing the diary comics for a long time. And then you said you're publishing them through Living the Line. So like is that part of just the daily again the sort of the ritual you build around like your workday, or is it just like I gotta process this somehow, so I'm gonna put it on paper, or how does it work?
I've done it daily for a while. These days, it's when it's kind of funny. I was living in Las Vegas for the last 2 years, and that's where the majority of the diary comics that I'm putting together now are.
Right.
It's really funny because I was having these really exciting days were happening. I was going to these crazy parties and I was doing all this stuff, but that doesn't really enter into the diary comics for the most part because it's usually days that I was either like bored, listless, or had something I needed to process going on that was like an emotional thing.
Mm.
So I'll tell people stories about like, oh, here's a crazy thing that happened at this like mansion party I was at in Las Vegas. And people are like, yeah, is there a diary comic about that? And I was like, no, wasn't drawing that day. I was having fun, and then the processing stuff is much slower and more internal than external, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so at this point in time, is it still that kind of thing, or is it? Because I know you're doing more and more and more of them right now. So is it
Sure.
part of the daily task, or just is it still like whenever you're feeling you need to process this thing?
Yeah, it's whenever. I mean, because I'm working on Moonray right now, that kind of I'm working on Moonray and kind of patching together the diary thing into a book. That's another fascinating thing is taking because I mean basically it's about 5 years of diary comics, and
Hmm.
I'm figuring out how to arrange them in some kind of narrative that where a stranger can pick up this collection. It's going to be about 110 pages, I think,
Cool.
uh, where someone can pick up this collection and read through it without uh, and understand what's going on and get something out of it. There's been a lot of things where I've been like, I don't need to kind of explain everything about myself as long as the pages kind of like, yeah, I've been thinking a lot like a poetry book, like do these things work? Does kind of the emotional feelings or the things I'm trying to get through come through on this by itself without much explanation?
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And we were talking with Curtis a little bit before, like about the universal themes that can kind of come out regardless what you're doing. And even though it's your diary comic that's about this specific period of time, living in Vegas, doing all stuff, you're on these parties, but off days, you're not feeling so great. Those things are still very universal. Like I felt like that with especially I loved Rain Like Hammers, like it's I mean, not just because I do have a major bias, you're my friend, I enjoy your work. But I thought it was such a great way to create this compelling narrative that discussed something intensely personal to you, but also like as a person who's existed on planet Earth for a while, you experience things, and it's like,
Sure.
oh man, like I know how that feels for this guy in this weird sci-fi world dealing with walking cities and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, I mean
um,
that's the advantage of science fiction in general. I think is we can
yeah,
take ideas and I think abstract them into fictional worlds, and
right.
then they kind of. I mean, something that's really cool about that I've been enjoying about comics. I just picked up this book yesterday, The Kinder Kids,
Oh yeah, there we go.
and it came out. If I'm remembering right, it came out in 1905.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
A, a German American living in Germany doing these comic books for American newspapers, and it just has like I was like 3 pages into it, and I was cracking up because there's a guy fishing, and the fish that's caught says, "You are no gentleman." I was just thinking like that's a joke that someone like in 1905 did a fishing joke that is like just him and his pen. They printed it, and it's funny now. And
Yeah.
I like that how like distilling down things, and I don't know. And it's a cool medium, and it's cool that just a couple people can do this thing because you always think about like the production of a lot of other mediums of animation and film and everything, and it takes it to this much higher level where it's like, how am I going to get $8 gazillion so I can tell a personal story? It's very different than being like, I have a pen and I just need to find a place to publish this.
Yeah, didn't necessarily wait to talk about it a little bit, but I think go into it now. I think that's really one of the cool things about Moonray is that, like, so if you're not familiar, Brandon's writing and drawing a book with Churchill Penalta called Moonray. First hardcover's out, the second one's coming out in May. But they're concurrently using that as the sort of like blueprint and narrative engine for this video game. So it's also being developed. And there you go. We both have our copies
It's the
there.
same copy.
The same copy right over here. Anyway, it's pretty cool to see because the comics medium is so intensely personal, in the case with you, and I mean, in Sure, you're writing it, but he's line art, coloring, your lettering,
Yeah, yeah, I should. Yeah, so basically, I'm doing the main longer story in it.
right?
Joshua, who does this much more like detailed Jeff Darrow, intense style, is doing kind of a self-contained backup stories in each issue that I'm writing, and it's very collaborative because I will send him, very similar to how I worked on Prophet with Simon Roy and Farrell and that whole crew, is I do really rough, ugly stick figure layouts, and then I send it to him, and then Show changes it and makes it good. and he does a lot of like he'll be like, I added this whole scene, I changed this, and that's a really nice thing about working with a storyteller, is there, he has the ability to be like, this doesn't work for me, let's make it work. So it's nice to give him those ideas and see what I get back.
Yeah, not to get too far ahead, but there's a cool bit in volume 3 that I think emerged that way. There's a fight scene and it's really cool.
I mean, that's worth talking about because it's such a cool thing in the process of like,
go.
I basically set up this whole like, oh, these characters are dealing with this group of guys following them, and then I don't even remember who came up with this. There's this kind of Voltron combining characters into one super being thing that happened, and Shosho just ran with it, and I think it's like 60 pages of just this intense, beautiful fight scene that's just like I don't generally I think I do more kind of comedic action, but he just took it into this incredibly beautiful, compelling battle of weird post-human beings that I think is really gonna impress people. Yeah,
Moonray Volume 3, it's gonna be sick. But yeah, it's cool though, because again, it's so the comic, I mean, there are people we're bringing in, which we're not going to do now, but helping out with the comic. But it's cool because then you look at the video game and there's like dozens of people, but they're taking this like intensely personal story, and a lot of the time, obviously, I mean, this is an extremely unusual way to make a video game,
Yeah, I guess the simple way to explain it is like they were doing it in reverse of other video game comics where they had an initial game that they'd started on, and video games take a very long time to make. And so like they hit me up and were like, let's figure out the lore for this stuff. And we just did it as a comic book. And it's perfect because like I'll be like, here's a story, here's a fun thing to do this week. And then the guys developing the video game will just look at the comic and be like, oh, here's a weird monster that's in the game now. And some stuff doesn't make it and other stuff does. And it makes this like, I think it creates this level of freedom for both sides.
Yeah. No, Curtis
working as art director on the video game, and that helps because he's tied into the comic.
But that emerged from the comic, right? Because he was working on the comic first, and then through the development of that, he worked in the game. Yeah, Curtis talks a lot about like the jazz of the creative process, and it's so cool to see it. A lot of time when we talk about that, and he's worked a lot in games, and I've worked a lot in games, and there's that element of it there. But seeing, like again, it's you and Churchill are a duo on the comic. And then to see that translated amongst dozens of people, it's a really natural, cool way to work that I've never seen before. So
yeah, it really feels like we're doing some kind of it feels like the Old West in some ways, like just like going out into unexplored territory and trying to figure out how to do things.
Yeah. Well, that's what's really exciting to me about like now, I mean, I've given you this rant before, so I'll give you the short version because you know this is on the internet. It's not like our usual phone calls. But anyway, like it's 1968 today, right? It's 1968, and people are ready for something new, and someone's about to make Easy Rider, right? It's gonna hit next year, and I feel like stuff like Moonray, stuff like we have a buddy Chris Hunt, stuff he's doing Code of the West, stuff that we're doing with Best Vision, stuff that like Patara on Kuroshi and Axe Wielder John and Rob and Plate Lunch, like it's like stuff is getting weird and cool in these like really cool fringe indie places. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's
I get what you're
Moonray's
saying.
not like the video game guys. It's a huge game. It's a huge company. Like it's not like a couple of dudes, you know. So it's cool to see that translate on such a scale.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like for a long time, comics, the larger kind of idea of American comics was very locked into um, this is the one way to do it. This is, and we both kind of worked in that industry very much.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
feels that probably for the first time, certainly for the first time in a decade, the future for comics feels like it's going in unexpected directions.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's like all these different components, right? Like we've talked a lot about distribution, the way distribution's evolving, and that I have made the argument in the past that the history of the comics medium is really a history of distribution, right? Like
Sure.
the short version of this is Max Gaines figures out, hey, the people really like buying the Sunday comics section, so I'm going to fold that and sell it for 10 cents a pop. And then other people are like, well, what if we actually publish our own? So you get like Famous Funnies, which is like republishing old comics, and then
Yeah.
National does New Fun. And it's kind of loosely that, like the comics format we have is essentially like that folded over. So it starts off a newsstand, and then 60s and 70s we start the self-distribution in like head shops, which Phil
Sure.
Suling sees in New York and is like, well, what if publishers like Marvel, who are struggling right now, sell it directly to us, and then we, whatever, sell like that. You get the direct market, and then from the direct market, you get some weird dude in Canada who's like, I love Barry Windsor Smith. I want to do my Conan book, and he does Cerebus, and it
Sure.
evolves. It's constantly evolving. And right now, like there's these critical juncture points. I would say every 20, 30 years of things rapidly evolving,
Mhm.
right? Like I think the last time this happened was 1995, right when Heroes World collapsed and there was a distributor, sort of like well, it all folded into Diamond essentially,
Yeah.
and like right now we're seeing this other thing, like after COVID, and there was, Diamond, of course, was still there. They're working with us actually on Moonray. But then you got Lunar, and then you got Penguin Random House doing single issue comics.
Sure.
Um, uh,
And also the idea
what
that
that means for guys like us is really interesting.
oh yeah, yeah. And also people can do comics and not and 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 reach an audience in ways that they don't have to go through distribution channels and
Oh
comic.
yeah,
That's nice. I think one of the reasons that me
yeah.
and you working with comic stores is that we like that environment.
Mhm.
Like having a good comic store is such an important thing to me when I'm in a city. Like in
Yeah,
LA, Golden Apple is fantastic. I've been
yeah,
going
yeah,
there every week, and in Vegas, alternate reality is just like became like this. Like it was like my kind of social hub every week. I remember me and my partner Casey were like um would like we would leave alternate reality sometimes and look at our watches and be like, that was 2.5 hours we were in the
yeah.
comics.
I mean, we were doing the same thing actually with Casey when we would go to there was Cosmic Monkey in Portland, Oregon,
That's
you know,
fantastic.
and it was, I mean, fantastic store, great staff. Also, they had everything, but it was like I just like going there, to hang out with you and Casey, but also like the guys there love comics and know comics, and we'd go in there and there'd be like, hey, did you see this really weird kung fu comic that came out in 1980? Like, here's a copy of Jade Man in your box that we had reserved for you. You know what I mean? And it was just like it was something I either knew but I didn't have or never had seen, and so it like propagated this like love of comics. But yeah, I mean, there was a big movement, obviously, in the late '90s and through 2000s for like, oh, web comics. So we don't need self distribution. I think there's, there was ability for that, and a lot of successful books came out of that.
Sure.
But I think that's like what we're heading towards. All these different separate channels are now sort of like you can choose them a la carte, but you can also like take them and then do something totally different with them. I don't see it. A lot of people say, well, this one thing is a solution to the future of comics or whatever. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like we have all these different channels. Why not utilize them? And then exciting stuff gets out there because, like, I mean, that's how you got like Rio. We're talking about Rio earlier. How many different formats did that come in? How many different publishers did that go through? You
That's
know?
another thing to jump on too, is because so you got your copy of Rio there.
Oh yeah.
I think I would argue that that is the best Western comic, the best cowboy comic I've ever read.
Really, like I don't know that I disagree, but that's a big claim.
Um,
Because
yeah, well, I'm trying
blueberry,
to think.
I mean, blueberry is the obvious other
I prefer it
choice.
to Blueberry, and I got I got Mobius here just living by my
Yeah,
desk. But
sure, sure.
Blueberry is kind of stressful for me, honestly. I think because the format, and that's an interesting thing, kind of going back to distribution and how we present stuff. Is, if I
Yeah,
remember right, Blueberry was essentially written for half-page release ever
right,
compared to collections, and
right, right.
so it reaches this like bottleneck point every half page where something stressful is going to happen. A guy shows up behind him with a gun or something, and it just kind of becomes too much for me. I'm just like, oh, they've almost killed this guy like 6 times in 4 pages,
Mhm.
and I think Rio, because it's made for, I don't know what his initial release was, but the format that you have now, and I have it in anthology format too. I think
Yeah,
Epic Comics put it out, and it just really works as just a great Western story. It's like, and I think that one is
yeah,
3 stories put together.
yeah. I think so.
Yeah, and I always enjoy like things like samurai stories or cowboy stories. Really work as science fiction too. Like if you take the basis of like, like there's that great Kira Kurosawa movie Yojimbo that then
Right.
was remade into Sergio Leone movie and then remade, and the Sergio Leone movie is set as a Western, and then there's also a Bruce Willis one set during the 1920s that no one talks about. It's the
Yeah.
same story but just different formats, and so
I
I like
mean,
when you
Hidden
have like,
Fortress and Star Wars, dude.
oh yeah,
The same thing. But no, yeah, it's. We talk about this a lot, but I am really excited for where we're going because like people who get doom and gloom about comics, I feel like when you're thinking like 6 months ahead. But if you look not just years ahead, but then years behind and see where we've gone and see how things have
yeah.
developed and see what comes out of like periods when things get down, like it's always really exciting.
Oh, I have
You
to tell you
know,
my Star Wars Redemption story recently.
let's hear it. Let's go.
Yeah, this might be super boring to talk about, but essentially, like I had written off Star Wars as essentially a ruined franchise in my head because
Uh-huh.
I grew up on the first three movies, or the four, five, and six,
Sure.
and I was like, those are hugely influential for me. And then when the prequels came out, I was amazed at how bad they were, you
Right.
know, and I was just like kind of disinterested in Star Wars. And recently, Casey has been going and watching the Clone Wars series, and it's fascinating that they set them in between these horribly done movies, and they flesh things out and they explain things, and they basically like they add so much weight and value to the story that's changing my like as I didn't it didn't occur to me before, as much as you can kind of shrink a universe by making bad decisions, you can then expand it again. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't kill something to just make a bad version of it. And I have this idea sometimes when I'm not in a good headspace when I'm doing a comic, and I'll be like, I did a new page or something, and I'm like, I don't know if this is going in a good direction, but it gives me this idea that you can breathe life back into a story by just trying different things and freeze things up in certain ways.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome, man. Right on. Well, that really does resonate. Like in the last interview that Curtis was doing with Liam McIntyre, they were talking about that a bit about like the things that lead you, not even just in your own work, but of course in your life, and you see these things. And like a friend of mine once said that, when you look forward, it all looks like chaos, whether it's your life or your art table. And then you look
Sure.
back and it all looks like plot. Like you can kind of see it out.
That's
Um,
a cool way to look at it. And we were talking
yeah.
before about the Hammers book, and
Hmm.
it's nice talking to so many people that connected with, because I always think back that while it's probably the book that I enjoyed working on the least in my career,
Yeah.
because it was dealing with a lot of rough emotional stuff, and I was really unsure if it made any sense because I was dealing with, I mean, the basic story is there's an old criminal who ends up switching his mind gets switched to a genetically engineered butler, and then he
Right.
can see his life. He basically gets to look at his life from a different body. And because he's in a different body, he's different chemical reactions, and he essentially becomes like a different person while his body continues on without him and living his life and looking back at his past. And so
Yeah.
it's weird sometimes when you're in it, both life and stories, to be like, I hope this works. And there's a certain amount of just blind faith you have to have that, like, even if it doesn't, it's hopefully it works out. And if it doesn't work out, then it's better to attempt something than not attempt it.
Yeah, no, no, exactly. And I think that when again we're sitting, in your case you're at the artboard, in my case, I'm in Scrivener or whatever I'm writing in, like it's obviously, you're a singular experience, but I think really just good work has those universal things in it. Like I am curious. So you mentioned how sci-fi does this really well, but was there any sci-fi books in your formative years or even recent years that were like, that kind of gives the feeling that I want to have in my own work, or like that to help develop that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, recently I've been really clicking with Charles Stross' work.
Hmm.
Uh, he's a science fiction author. He has kind of a like almost like a Warren Ellis feeling to some of his work. He did a thing called The Laundry Files, which is a series that's almost like the X Files in England, where they'll be like, oh, turns out elves are real and they're interdimensional evil beings that are trying to take over Earth, and we're just barely keeping them back. But he did this. He had this book that I really connected with. I'll back up a little bit. One of my
Sure.
favorite things when I was younger is the relationship between Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers and Joseph Hadelman's The Forever War. So
Hmm.
Starship Troopers is essentially Heinlein writing about part of it's like his ideal society, and how basically people join the military and give service to their community as a like that gives you the right to vote.
Yeah.
And a very positive idea of like, this is how we, it's a very like this is how we give society purpose and give people responsibility and everything. And Joseph Hadelman had just gone out of Vietnam and read that book, and it was a much more cynical view of things. And so he wrote The Forever War, which is about a guy that keeps uh, in this endless war, and because of um, Einstein's relativity idea, every time he travels faster than light, time keeps moving and he stays the same age. And so
Hmm.
this, like, he lives past a humanity he can relate to, and eventually, I mean, essentially, he lives long enough where there's just gay clones, and he's the last kind of heteronormative dude that exists,
Hmm.
very much of its era. But those books, in contrast to each other, is such a cool conversation. And in the same way, also based off a Robert Heinlein book, his book Friday. So he wrote this book Friday, which is about an artificial person working as a spy in the future
Okay.
society. This woman named Friday, and Charles Stross wrote a book called Jupiter's Children, which is about or Saturn's Children, whatever the famous painting is of the guy eating the child.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, the Saturn eating his child. Yeah.
Yeah, Saturn's Children. So he wrote this book called Saturn Children, which is about basically a robot. It's basically like a robot prostitute that is comes online just as humanity dies out, and she's
Okay.
living in a post-human only robot society where she is basically made to serve humanity, and artificial intelligence and robots have moved on, and they think of her as just a weirdo, and she's got to survive for thousands of years just like with no contact for her purpose that she was built for. Like, she's never met a human. It's
Oh,
really fascinating.
wild.
Yeah.
And so all kind of sense, like I know you've been a Highland reader for a long time, but is the confluence of these like, have you a recent thing? And if so, like how has that been affecting your work? Like how does that translate?
I mean, so I'm hopefully I'm not muddling it too much, but the idea I'm
No,
trying to
let's
get at
go.
is like, it's conversations with other work. So
Right.
it's like, and so that's something I really connect with, is both in positive and negative ways. Being like, I read a book and I have a feeling about it. Like, there's always the cliche idea of where do your ideas come from, but I think that's
Hmm.
a really important point, because if you're working, like if you're trying to make art and that is how you make your living, then you better figure out where your ideas come from, right?
Yeah.
And for me, a lot of it is both a reaction to life and a reaction to other work. And I love the reaction to other work because, you like when I read through every Tintin book while I was working on Rain Like Hammers, and it really informed a lot of, like, I was reading it and trying to dissect why does Tintin work so well for me, and um, and then trying to put that into my own work in a more subtle way than the books that I'm talking about, hopefully. But
Yeah,
yeah,
well, Kirby talks about this a lot. About he said the comic book medium is a medium of he said evolvement. I think it meant of like evolving, you know, and like kind of like we're talking about with distribution earlier. It starts off as a single panel, then goes into like a multiple panel strips, and then goes into those like the Prince Valiant, Little Nemo, big Sunday page kind of things, and then you get that, and you get comics, and you get and our role as comic book creators is to like be the rocket ship, like okay, we'll ask like what's next, you know, and
yeah. Another interesting point in this too is the idea of, I think of it as, I've called it like currency of cool or something, was that I was
yeah,
referring to it, is sometimes the trajectory that a piece of work is on speaks the same language as you. You'll be like, I read, if you're someone who read Frank Miller's Daredevil, and then you read Ninja Turtles, and then you read something that was inspired by Ninja Turtles, then you're following this trajectory. But sometimes you'll find work that's really quality work, but you don't speak the same language as it. You don't use the same currency of it. I think of it as like, you know, having like a euro and going to Mexico and being like, can I buy these? Can I buy these shoes? And that's not the money we use here. And because there's all this, like something that I always push back against when people are like, these are the must read comic books that you have to have. And like Rio's not in that when you see like
not at all, yeah.
comics. And like I was in my 40s when I discovered Rio, and I was basically like, why did no one tell me about this amazing piece of work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff, you know, like kicking around from that time period, or in general, or like I think of a guy like Alex Toth, you know, who his stuff is at the central DNA of so many creators. Um, I mean, it be well beyond the obvious guys, you know, I'm thinking like, you know, people like Bruce Timm or whoever, but like just in his basic language of storytelling, you
Oh yeah,
know.
we
And
were talking about the
there's
new.
some collections like Bravo for Adventure, and you and I were talking about Zorro the other day, but like there's so much of that stuff, like his Hot Wheels comics and stuff, that I don't even know if any of that's in print.
Oh yeah, I have some of those Hot Wheel comics. John Arcudi gave me a box of Toth,
Great guy. I'd love to get that guy in here, by the way, John
yeah,
Arcudi.
I talked to him last week. But
Oh, right on.
what were we talking about? Oh, Toth stuff. Yeah, we were just talking about the Sean Gordon Murphy Zorro book, and I was
Right.
lamenting. I was like, what a cool opportunity would it be to put like half Sean Gordon Murphy, half Alex Toth Zorro in one book.
That'd
And I
be
haven't
so
read
cool.
the Toth Zorro, I've just seen the great covers he did.
No, he's doing a great job with it.
I went to watch the
But
Zorro anime the other day when I saw the Sean Gordon Murphy thing being announced.
oh, whoa.
And
But see,
on
that's a
YouTube,
cool thing too, because like, you know, you're talking about there's the Toth version and there's a Sean
yeah.
Gordon Murphy version, and then now it's like Sean's gonna build this bridge into whatever this next thing is, and it could be riffing on what he's doing or totally different from what he's doing. You know, that's a fascinating thing with I mean, work in general, but especially, you know, comics.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. But I also think about like, you know, shoot, what is that book? I've got it right. One of my mentors is the guy Jim Haynes. He talks a lot about reading Tropic of Cancer, and like he read it once when he was in his 20s, and once when he was in his 30s, and once in his 40s, and then he read it essentially every decade. And it's like obviously it's the same exact book, but as you get older and like you're revisiting it and it changes for you, you know. And I find that way with creators. Like we were talking about Blueberry earlier. Like when I first got into Mobius, I mean, my first point of contact was probably Silver Surfer. You know, it was the '80s and it was his first big mainstream thing.
Sure.
But I was really into throughout my 20s. It was all about, you know, the first, you know, 3 to 4 epic books, you know, like that's what I had, you know, the Stella Nadina stuff and
Mhm.
all the sci-fi things. And I remember I went to in my mid 20s, well, late 20s, early 30s, I went to an exhibit of his stuff in Paris, and there were these massive blueberry pages.
Mhm.
And being a little bit older, and it was more my interest, I was kind of getting away from sci-fi stuff and more in the westerns or whatever. But just seeing the craft, because they're massive pages, like in terms of like actual physical boards, and the level of detail and like the way I remember there was the exact moment, actually I can't remember the exact page or which volume it was, but there was a a lamp that you'd take like on a table at a saloon in I think a Blueberry. And the
Uh,
level of craft was so intense that I was like, nah, I'm a Blueberry guy. Because of where I'm at in my life and then where the contact point is and how that changes, you know. Even though this is work that I was generally familiar with in another phase of my life, in another format, you know, now
yeah,
that I'm revisiting it, it changes and changes and changes and goes on. So that's really
yeah. The
exciting.
format thing, it's slightly off topic. The format thing was
Let's
reminding me.
go.
Thing I've been trying to mess with lately is, I'll show you some examples here. So I'm doing, where is it here? So my diary comics I draw in a sketchbook. This
Right
one's
on.
named Dean Stockwell. I like to name all my sketchbooks.
RP.
Um, and then the Moonray pages, I'm doing standard 11 by 17 comic sizes, kind of what like your average Marvel comics drawn these days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm working on this other comic I'm calling En route, but I don't know if it has a name now. And this is like a one shot I'm doing. I'm doing these giant pages.
Whoa. Is that
Um,
2 up or how big is that?
it's a little. So here's a standard 11 by 17. So it's
Wow.
almost twice the size. Um, yeah, this one's taking me a little longer, but basically my plan is between each Moonray book, I'm going to be doing first the diary book and then that, and then I have a bunch of stuff to reprint as well. But yeah, and that's been an interesting thing, not in just format of how things are released, but in format of like how I make something really kind of changes like the approach to it. And like I noticed with these pages, like it basically is speed. Like I do this one, I do diary pages in my sketchbook essentially because I can do it like on a bus or in a cafe really easily. And then these ones are like, you know, I try to do 4 or 5 of these a week and get them
Mm-hmm.
done. And these things take a little longer, but it's been interesting.
So
And
was
then
that
now
a conscious decision or was that a gut thing where you're like, I'm gonna do something weird, or you just had it around, or how did that decision get made?
I mean, it was
Why are you
really,
doing this?
yeah. I mean, well, there I definitely have a romanticism about giant pages. Like Jack Kirby worked that big. Paul Pope.
Yeah.
I recently watched the kayfabe video with Paul Pope that came out recently, and that was really cool to see. And while he's doing the interview, behind him, he's got a bunch of pages hung on his wall. And I was thinking,
Yeah.
behind my computer here that I'm talking to you on, I have a string of clothespins that have all the pages that I'm working on here.
Right.
And I was thinking if I'm gonna actually do video stuff, I should have more than my Barba Papa and the Blondie poster behind me and show the work.
I don't know, man. Blondie and Barber Papa is a good combo. Yeah, I will say it around about Pope. There at the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco, there was an exhibit. It was just like Batman's 75th anniversary or something like that. I remember they had a big Batman exhibit, and there was like all these really standard comic size pages because most of the art was probably from this maybe that's not even the 60s, like 70s and up, you know. And then so they're pretty much the size of the Moonray pages, but Paul Batman Year 100 page was just massive. I mean, it had to be I don't like what Hal Foster was drawing on. It was so huge that you're like,
Yeah, and
man,
they done it as a huge.
I want that artist edition. I want the actual size, 10 foot tall Paul Pope, original art edition.
Oh yeah, the artist edition no one can fit in their homes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's fascinating. I mean, it definitely shows to me that he's coming from a pre-scanner era because that's
Yeah.
been a big thing. Because I have an 11 by 17 scanner I do all my pages on now, and even the larger pages I'm working on, like I got to piece those together.
Hmm.
And they're smaller than what Pope does.
Yeah. But I think you guys are just focusing. I mean, Pope obviously was a pretty big influence on you, and I'm assuming still to this day, even though that you know him. But I think you guys, one of the through lines between your two work is that you guys are just love making this thing, and I've never asked Paul about this, but I just wonder like to what extent he was just like, it's just that's what I'm gonna do, and we'll worry about that part later. You know?
Yeah, I mean, for him, it sounded like it was a fight because he was in an academic world that just had no interest in comics, and
Right,
I feel like I really had the advantage growing up in a household where comic books were just like what we read,
right, right.
and
Right
like
on,
not
man.
really having any pushback. I mean, my pushback is always like my frustration sometimes is dealing with a comics community that doesn't seem as excited about comics as we are,
Yeah.
because I'm a little too obsessive, and then like, um,
I've given you this rant before.
sure,
I think that's a false positive. I think I have this nephew who loves comics and he just
sure,
wants to know how to get them. And like I went through a period where kind of my interest in comics waned down, but just being around this dude, I was just like, and actually we started going to Cosmic Monkey in Portland. and I
Yeah.
just got so stoked. And when I meet people who read comics, like I go to the comic store called Captain Comics in Idaho. Everyone there is stoked. They're a fully staffed store. Everyone there is stoked and knows a lot. Like if I ask anybody there, and there's usually like 4 to 6 people working, they all have a recommendation. They're all stoked about something. You know, it's like this the
It's a good.
negativity, I think, is a false positive because of what social media propagates. Like
Yeah, yeah.
people who want to
That's
read comics
actually,
are ready to go.
yeah. I think that's a better way to say what I should have said. Let me back up a little bit. Essentially,
All
what I
right,
think is
rewind.
there's like I feel like too much of social media dominates what comics is about, and it gets so stupid. Like I try to avoid the stuff even, but there'll be like people fighting about a new X-Men cartoon, and
Yeah.
one of the characters being non-binary or something. And I was like, I don't like the shitty old X-Men cartoon. I don't care what they like. I don't like put a popsicle stick in a turd. I'm not going to watch it. You know.
Yeah.
But
But
that
it's
narrative becomes so much larger than like
right.
let's talk about what George Harriman's life was like, which to me is so much more fascinating that you have all these creators so you can go back. Like Harriman's another guy who was doing comics in 1905, did Crazy Cat and Ignatz. It was funny. I was reading the intro to this Kinder Kids book,
Hmm.
talking about how this was like their attempt at doing like really fine art comics for the mainstream, and it wasn't very
Sure.
successful. And in it, they do the introduction is a dig at Crazy Ignatz, and they're just like, I guess readers wanted to see just a rat throwing a brick instead of this. And I was reading, and I was like, how dare you? Like that.
Yeah.
Crazy Cat is such an amazing, cool comic, and yes, there is a rat throwing a brick, but it's beautiful.
But it gets into what you were talking about earlier with with Rain Like Hammers, like when Professor Pup longs for love, you're like you excuse me, Inspector Pup. I can't remember the exact name of the character.
Right, the dog
Inspector
cop.
Pup.
Yeah,
Yeah, the dog cop from Crazy Thing. That's like you're like, I get that. I know how that feels, and it resonates, even though the comic came out in 1919 or 1920, whenever it was.
yeah.
Um,
Funny, I just saw Silver Sprocket, the small press publisher, has a
sure.
presentation they did at Comics Pro, which is like a retailer summit thing,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they had like their logo is it's a little, but their logo is like a character that says ACAB on the butt, and
yeah.
not Professor Pup. Like my stupid brain just goes to comic books, being like, not this fiction. And I know Professor Pup's kind of a dick, but someone's got
Yeah.
to catch that Ignatz.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, I love it, man. Well, that's totally cool. Um, so we are almost at time. So I'm kind of wondering which can of worms we should be opening up. But I don't know. I'm just curious. Is there anything you're reading right now that you're particularly like stoked about? Like not stuff that we're obviously we're working on, but um,
You mean
going
like in
for like what's that?
comics and comic stores?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or even like stuff that you've read that's coming up. I mean, we've talked a lot about how the cool stuff is coming from the fringe sometimes, and not even in comic stores. But like, what are you reading right now that you're pumped about?
I mean, it's kind of both forward and backward. I've been reading a lot more Walt Kelly Pogo.
Yep,
Um, one of the things I've been digging into is kind of the history of Disney,
yep,
and Kelly's a guy that worked at Disney and then kind of chose his own path at a certain point.
yeah.
And you get this brilliant social commentary in Pogo. And Pogo is something I don't think I appreciated when I was younger, and
Oh, not
now
at
I'm
all.
reading it. It's so sharp and so exactly what, like, it's stuff that feels so relevant now that it's like the joke of listening to Tupac albums where he's predicting the future. Walt
Hmm.
Kelly just like really clicked into some social stuff. And then, I mean, there's new books coming out too. The rare flavors. No, that's is that there's a new Rom V book I've been reading.
Oh yeah, I think it is rare flavor. I know what you're talking about. It's
Rare
from
flavors.
Boom.
It's
It's
really
Ron
good.
V. Yep.
Yeah, it's about a essentially like an Indian god that is trying to start a culinary show, and it's
Hmm.
really fun and cool. I'm excited to check out the Sean Gordon Murphy Zorro. I haven't read that yet because it's sold out
Yep.
at the comic store I go to, which is a nice thing to see.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm trying to think. I just saw a Frank Quietly sketchbook that was printed, a little tiny thing at this bookstore I was at yesterday, and I'm thinking of going back and getting that. It just shows his pencils, which is exciting.
Oh, I've got that. That's a great book. Yeah. There was a store in Ireland, I think, put it out. like Big
Okay.
Bang or something like that. Yeah,
Really
that's a cool
tiny. That was
sketchbook.
the one thing that stopped me
Yeah,
from getting, is I was like, I want that pulp size quietly stuff. Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff coming out. I always there's too much to read in comics all the time. I'm trying to think. I got a reading stack here of things. Oh, this is a book I've been really excited about. It's called Go with the Clouds North by Northwest.
hmm
It's a manga about a half Japanese, half Icelandic, I think, uh, a guy who can talk to machines, and he does these little tasks for people where he'll be like, someone's dog is missing, let me talk to cars and see where it is. And this had this sequence in, I think, the newest volume, volume 6, that really blew me away, where the character goes back to Japan, and he's drinking this special tea, which is they sell as like a really big deal. It's really delicious, and he drinks it, and a 2-page sequence of just what the tea tastes like visually, and it's like leaves on the wind falling on a river, and it making like pools of water in the river, and it's so cool to see taste visually shown in a manga. And the back of every volume has like this one just has different European signs on it. I think is a cool. Yeah, this is the manga I'm most excited about lately.
dude, right on. Well, we are close to at time. There's been a lot of comments in the Discord, but I think overall, man, you made a good case for there's just a lot of exciting stuff going on. I'm really excited to see. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I'm excited to see how things continue to evolve in with Moonray. I don't know if people want to get more of you, like where do they find you on the internet?
I mean, Instagram's a good spot. Just Royal Brandon on Instagram is a easy way to find me, and
Mhm.
from there I've got a Patreon link, and I'm doing me and Casey put out a newsletter that we're going to start up again. Just kind of keep people informed of what we're up to. Um, yeah, yeah, and hopefully in comic stores.
Right on, man. Well, we are at time. I assume Curtis is going to come in and steal us away here, but I always love talking comics with you, dude. I always get pumped up. So,
Yeah,
we should do this again sometime.
totally. What are you reading
So,
today?
what am I reading today? That's a really great point. Well, I put some stuff aside to talk about here, and we talked about two of them. We talked about Rio, we talked about Pogo, we did talk about Cerebus a little bit, but your friend and mine, living the line, Sean Michael Robinson, he's been doing the production on these new editions of
Oh
Cerebus.
yeah, that reminds me. I have
I,
this by me.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Strange Death. Uh, this is one of my favorite volumes. I think never gets talked about because Dave saying blah 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 blah, but then like at this point in the series, the level of craft is so sharp that I feel
Mhm.
like I just keep this by my desk. Like, okay, I just flipped through a random spread. Look at this double page spread of just like trees. Those are the
Nice.
coolest trees I've ever seen in my life, you know?
Catching on the background too.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of looks like Franklin Booth almost,
Yeah.
you
What's
know?
with
And it's
give me the cover of that? Does it have like a gold logo?
yeah, it's got a sweet gold foil edition.
Nice.
So yeah, I don't know. That's pretty cool. Um, and it's of course it's got all his like back matter and stuff and the appendixes and cool weird sketchbook material.
Oh,
But I like what you said a lot about um, going forward and back, you know. Um, like certain trying to think of what I could talk about 'cause some of the stuff is not announced yet. But I think overall I am more pumped than ever when it comes to comics
nice.
because of these kind of conversations, the conversations that I had today, or like just anytime I like I we'll end on this note. Like I have the spinner rack here and I kind of like curate it like a bonsai tree, like I go and I snip some stuff, I'll take this off, like I don't know. And I have themes. And every time I do, I just think about how far we've gone and all the hardship that's come and stuff that's been overcome and stuff that's changed. And I look to the future and I'm like, dude, it's just gonna be exciting. So anyway.
Nice.
All right, buddy. Well, it's good talking with you. Yeah, let's do this again sometime, man.
Certainly. Yeah. Good talking, Joe.
All right.